Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Economic Insecurity and Abuse in Later Life, hosted by Wider Opportunities for Women. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sarah Gonzalez-Bosinski. I'm the Director of the Economic Security for Survivors Project, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, I wanted to just do a little bit of housekeeping so you're familiar with this webinar platform. Your lines have all been muted to ensure that background noise is minimal so we don't interfere with the speakers' presentations. If you have any questions or technical problems, please feel free to use the meeting chat icon located in the bottom right-hand corner. It looks like the little speaker box. That'll allow you to contact the WOW administrator, so you can reach out to my dear colleague Mallory, who can help you with any problems you're having there. Also, following the presentation, we're going to open up the chat function so you can ask any specific questions you may have of our speakers, but don't hesitate to submit questions throughout the presentation and we'll get to them at the end. For those of you who are new to WOW, Wider Opportunities for Women is a national research, advocacy, and technical assistance organization based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to build pathways to economic security, independence, and equality of opportunity for women, families, and elders. Our work promotes policies and practices that increase job quality, improve gender equity, and empower women economically. We have a number of different projects that help us advance these goals, including the Elder Economic Security Initiative and the Economic Security for Survivors Project, which are featured in today's webinar. But WOW also has a long history of advancing opportunities for women in non-traditional occupations through our National Center for Women's Employment Equity, as well as advocating for policies that help put economic security within the reach of families through our Family Economic Security Project. Funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, the S Project provides training and technical assistance to groups that serve survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking, with the goal of addressing issues around safety and economic security. The S Project helps build, protect, and restore economic security for survivors. We work with service providers, the criminal justice system, and other community institutions across the country to help build their capacity to respond to the financial effects of abuse and help overall improve survivor safety and justice. And we do this through a number of different ways. We work with direct service providers and victim advocates to enhance survivor economic security through the integration of career and economic support into core services that focus on promoting independence and stability. We educate advocates and survivors about opportunities to recover from the economic cost of abuse and survivors' employment rights. The S Project also works with the criminal justice system to reduce economic barriers to seeking help by implementing a variety of strategies that protect and restore survivors economically and also serve to hold perpetrators fully accountable for their crimes, including those that related to economic abuse. We work to streamline processes so participation in the justice system does not create unnecessary financial hardship. And we strongly support the use of protection orders and restitution as a means of securing economic relief and justice. The S Project also engages a number of community stakeholders such as employers, job training programs, and educational institutions to educate them about the intersections of domestic and sexual violence and how that relates to their economic insecurity, what their role as stakeholders are in addressing violence and abuse, and their responsibility to help uphold survivors' rights. Monday, June 15th, we commemorated World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day was created to increase the understanding of abuse and neglect of older persons by raising awareness of how culture, social structures, demographics, and economics affect elder abuse and neglect. We know that there are a number of distinct barriers that underserved communities face in building economic security, escaping or recovering from abuse, and seeking support and justice. So to further our understanding of these challenges facing older survivors, we wanted to host this webinar to explore these intersections of economic insecurity and elder abuse. Adults over 60 represent 18.5% of the U.S. population and are expected to grow to 20.2% by 2050. The growing population is really particularly vulnerable to physical and sexual violence, financial abuse, and neglect. Abuse may not be recognized, or evidence such as bruising may be dismissed as a symptom of old age or a side effect of some medications. And while the presence of abuse is significant, The resources and services available to help survivors are often limited or inaccessible due to a number of barriers they may face. Furthermore, economic insecurity that many elders face complicates the options that they have to seek safety and justice. Older survivors have fixed incomes and often limited savings and assets, and perpetrators who often have significant control and power over them use this to their advantage and undermine the safety and well-being of these survivors. So to learn more about elder economic insecurity and elder abuse, I want to turn to today's experts. We are thrilled to be joined by two national leaders who will discuss the economic reality of older Americans, abuse in later life, and the impacts of economic insecurity on older survivors of intimate partner sexual violence and stalking. First, we are joined by WOW's own Jo Reed, who is the director of the Elder Economic Security Initiative here at WOW. She oversees the SE initiative, which improves the economic well-being of older adults by raising awareness of financial needs, works to build state partners' capacity, and creating policy change on the local, state, and federal level. She provides strategic vision for the initiative, and WOW's broader economic security work and shapes our policy agenda. Before joining WOW, Jo served as a federal lobbyist and team leader at AARP for more than 25 years, focusing on livable communities issues such as housing, transportation, supportive services, low-income assistance programs, and consumer protection. Later, she coordinated research, training, and technical assistance activities related to livable communities as a senior program manager at the National Association for Area Agencies on Aging. We are also excited to be joined by Bonnie Brandel, who is the director of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. Bonnie acts as a liaison for national elder abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, and aging networks. She oversees and provides national technical assistance, training, program development, and support regarding abuse in later life. Bonnie has worked with battered women for over 25 years. She co-authored a book titled Elder Abuse Detection and Intervention, a Collaborative Approach. Her numerous published articles and manuals on abuse in later life have been distributed throughout the country. And for more than a decade, she has presented at national, regional, statewide, and local conferences on domestic violence and elder abuse. We are thrilled that she has the time to join us today, particularly knowing this is a very busy week. So we're happy to have her expertise here as well. So without further ado, I want to thank you both for being here. And at this point, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Jo, who's going to talk more about WOW's work and elder economic insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am so delighted to be here. And it's a pleasure to share with you a little bit about the Elder Economic Security Initiative, which we also call the Elder Initiative, or ESSI. So my plan is to talk a little about that, although Sarah's, I think, covered the ground pretty well now on what the initiative does, and then present the initiative's central tool, which is the Elder Economic Security Standard Index. That's a mouthful, so we call it the Elder Index for short. And then finally, I want to discuss our newest advocacy tool, the Elder Economic Insecurity Rates. And I hope this will provide a context for Bonnie's presentation on abuse in later life. So first, you've heard a brief description about WOW's activities overall, which traditionally were geared to economic security for women and their families. And in 2005, WOW expanded its scope to address economic security across the lifespan, and the Elder Initiative was born with the intent to focus on the economic condition and financial needs of older adults. As you've heard, the initiative offers a messaging framework and tools to shape policies and programs that build economic security for elders. And we have a network of partners spanning 20 states right now, which we are actively growing. We support them with research, analysis, and tailored advocacy tools, along with technical assistance, to help them achieve their advocacy objectives. So when we look at the most common reference point for measuring economic need and determining who qualifies for assistance, the starting point is usually poverty. And as I'm sure many of you on this call know, the federal poverty threshold was created in 1963 by an economist at the Social Security Administration, Molly Orshansky. I'm a fan of Molly's. She was doing an in-house research project on poverty, and she realized there was no widely accepted definition of poverty. So she developed one, initially for families with children only. And a year later, the war on poverty was declared. And how was it constructed? It was based on food costs. She looked at a survey of low-income family budgets from the mid-50s and noted that food represented about a third of household expenditures. So Orshansky proposed that for families of different sizes, the cost of that food basket be multiplied by 3, and that would be the line under which you were considered poor. Now, that calculus has remained fundamentally unchanged since, though the numbers have been updated for inflation. So the federal poverty level, or FPL for short, represents 3 times the cost of a family's basic food budget. Do you know what the average percentage spent on food by households is today? 13%. Ponder that. So the federal poverty level, or a percentage thereof, is widely used to determine eligibility for public support programs and benefits at several levels of government. What I think most advocates and service providers know is that the FPL offers a measure of abject deprivation, but not a meaningful benchmark for income adequacy. How are households doing that have $1, $100, or $1,000 above the FPL? Are they okay? Obviously not. So WOW set out to construct a measure that considers what it really takes to get by and reflects the actual environment in which people find themselves. To that end, working with our partners at the Gerontology Institute at UMass Boston and guided by a National Advisory Board of Experts, WOW created the Elder Economic Security Standard Index, or Elder Index. WOW asked the question, how do we define economic security, and what is an economic security income? Our answer is the Elder Index. This is the central tool for our Elder Initiative. So let's compare it to the federal poverty level. As noted, the FPL is based on food costs and assumes that these costs represent a third of a household's budget. The FPL does not incorporate health care costs, which we know are a disproportionate part of elder budgets. For that matter, it does not account for any other basic costs, such as housing. The FPL assumes that your costs are the same wherever you live. In determining the costs to be built into the Elder Index, WOW and the Gerontology Institute looked at older adults age 65 plus, referred to as elders, who were fully retired, lived alone or with an elder partner, and resided independently within the community. So our research excluded elders who lived in nursing homes or assisted living facilities or lived with larger families. Instead of considering food costs alone, the Elder Index incorporates all basic costs. Instead of assuming all households are the same, it recognizes critical differences in life circumstances, notably household composition, housing status, and health status. And finally, instead of assuming that it costs the same to live in Missoula, Montana, as it does in Manhattan, the Elder Index reflects the actual cost of living in your county or state. So, the Elder Index amounts to a definition of elder economic security. It provides a realistic measure of the level of income required to pay for the cost of all basic expenses faced by older adults. WOW defines economic security as having sufficient income to pay basic expenses without having to rely on public assistance, loans, or gifts. Even if someone's eligible for public assistance, we all know too well that the availability of that assistance may vary from year to year depending on what the appropriations process yields and other factors. So the Elder Index calculates the changing cost of these expenses and their sum nationally and for every county and state in the country. Moreover, it breaks those costs out based on whether the household is composed of a single elder or a couple, an owner with or without a mortgage, or a renter, and according to whether one's health is good, poor, or excellent. It focuses, as I mentioned, on limited but targeted segmentation, fully retired individuals and couples, 65 and older, living in the community. And in coming up with these numbers, it relies on publicly available, credible sources of data. So this is the Elder Index. Before your eyes glaze over, let me explain. On the left are various categories of cost going down from the top: housing, food, transportation, health care, and the miscellaneous expenses of personal care, soap, toiletries, a new blouse now and then. You'll note that housing costs, or actually you might not, so I want you to know that housing costs include all costs of owning or renting a home, including utilities, taxes, and insurance. Food costs are based on the USDA low-cost food plan. Transportation numbers are based on typical driving patterns for seniors in a given area, using the IRS per mile rate. And notable in that regard, one might wonder, well, where is the public transit cost built into this? The fact is that there are only about 6 metropolitan regions in the country where there is sufficient public transit to really have that be a legitimate basic cost of transportation that you could assume everybody had to go by. And finally, health care expenses assume Medicare Part B, either Medicare Advantage or Medigap, and prescription drug coverage for an elder in good health. This is taken from the Medicare Compare website. It can also be broken out for those, as I mentioned before, in other levels of health. So these components are calculated separately and summed to yield the annual expense for a senior individual or couple to live in a particular county. The bottom line: the average cost for a senior living alone to meet basic needs ranges from roughly $20,000 for an owner with no mortgage to over $30,000 for an owner still paying a mortgage. And the older renter is in the middle with, according to our current data, $24,024 in expenses. And this is also what we use as the basis for most of our analysis, the older renters numbers. For couples, the range is between $31,000 to $41,000. This is on the national level. So this next slide actually shows you what happens when we break it down by county in a particular state. And this is selected counties, not all the counties in the state of Maryland. But when you look at this, I mentioned that we could look at county level and compare. And when you do so, you can see that through this graph, it displays the differences in cost of living among them. For example, in this graph, you can see that seniors' costs in Allegheny County are less in all categories than in any of the other counties. The highest costs are in Howard and Montgomery counties. When we analyze the data in relation to senior income, we look at median rather than average income because the median is not affected by very large or small outliers. So if Bill Gates lived in Montgomery County, he could really skew the average. So although the typical single elder's monthly expenses, according to this table, in both Montgomery and Prince George's County are very close, there's a disparity in their median incomes. So a typical single elder in Prince George's County has significantly less income than a single elder in Montgomery County, but both face roughly the same basic expenses. So comparing local incomes to the Elder Index really paints the picture of elder economic insecurity in these areas. Okay, moving along. This graph tells us what we can really learn from the Elder Index. If we superimpose on reality-based costs some typical incomes in retirement, we get a sense of what people are really experiencing. So the first 2 columns are the average Social Security incomes for women and men. You can see that the average Social Security payment for women is $13,504 compared to $17,710 for men. The second columns are the median income in retirement for women and men, which include other sources of income such as pensions and 401ks. And again, you see that great disparity by gender. You notice that all of these incomes are above the federal poverty level, which is the central yellow horizontal bar. So we're done, right? but not so much, because when you look at the top yellow bar, you see the actual cost of living based on the elder index. Clearly, Social Security does not provide sufficient income on average to meet basic needs. Now I'm going to show you a couple of slides from our latest demographic briefs that will be coming out the week before the White House Conference on Aging. These look at nationally the differences by demographics, which are very significant. So this shows you the disparity, again, between men's and women's economic security, reflecting a difference in their income that is based in their working years and occupational segregation, lack of pay equity, time out of the labor force for caregiving, and so on, means that when people reach retirement age, there's a great disparity in income. So even though we have nearly half of all seniors at 45% who are below what we call the economic security line, the elder index, there's a 10 percentage point difference between men and women. The next one breaks it down by race and ethnic group. And here are some really, I think, pretty shocking percentages. These show that economic security and insecurity rates for elders nationally break down fairly dramatically by race and ethnic group. In the first column, you can see that Hispanic elder women are at 81% economic insecurity. 8 out of 10 elder women living in the community do not have enough income to meet their most basic needs. This is among single elders. It's less, of course, drastic among elder couples, because couples are much more secure than singles generally. But it's still very bad. So you go Hispanics, 81%, African Americans, 75% economically insecure, Asians, 67% economically insecure. Even among white elders, it is 54%, and that is not good. So I wanted to show you that. And this graph shows you the economic security gap, what we call the gap between what people's incomes are, and even with public assistance, how much of a gap remains for them between being able to meet their basic needs and reaching that economic security line. So a person with an income of $10,000, if they were able to get all of the public assistance for which they were eligible, and this is in a particular county, Bergen County, New Jersey, that would be $9,420 in the orange bar. They would still have a gap of $12,452 to be able to meet minimum income needs. And if you see that goes across higher and higher incomes all the way to the right, up to $24,000 income. If they got the full amount of public assistance for which they were available, they also would still be below the economic security line. This is something to think about and to be able to talk about with policymakers or just people in the community who think that low-income people, if they get all the supports out there, they should be fine. So economic insecurity rates are the latest tool that WOW has developed to help advocates make their case. These are the percentage of seniors with annual incomes that do not allow economic security. Again, they are below the elder index. And elders below the elder index but in this gap, are ineligible for public supports in many cases, and therefore are much more likely to rely heavily on Social Security. And as we have shown, Social Security is typically not enough to get by. So our data show that every state but Alaska has a larger percentage of seniors in this economic security gap than below the federal poverty level. That's a huge proportion of people who are probably not getting the supports that they need. And nearly every state has a larger population of insecure seniors who are ineligible for aid than those who are. This actually shows state by state and ranks them according to elder economic insecurity. Near the bottom, you see a white line going across. That is the economic insecurity rate nationally, and it's 45.1% of seniors are economically insecure. Then you'll see that at the top there of that list is Vermont. At 57%, Vermont seniors have the highest economic insecurity rate in the country, followed by elders in Massachusetts, Maine, New York, and Mississippi. Wyoming, on the other column at the bottom, has the lowest statewide EAR, as we call it for short, with just over one-third of elders living in insecurity. And that is 11 percentage points lower than the national average. You might notice that states in the Northeast and Southeast comprise most of the 20 states with the highest rates of insecure elders. And the U.S. EAR, as I said, is 40% for elder men and 49% for elder women. The EAR for single elder women households is 61%. And also, EARs, as I think we demonstrated before, are highest for non-white women at 70% for elder African American women, 74% for elder Hispanic women. So our analysis demonstrates that focusing only on the issue of poverty doesn't take proper account of seniors living in this gap between poverty and economic security. And high rates of elder economic insecurity really underscore the importance of state and federal programs which support both impoverished seniors and those seniors who live in that security gap, such as the Older Americans Act and many other programs out there. You can use the Elder Index for a variety of purposes. I would say most folks are using it for policy advocacy. You can use it to drive home the point of how many seniors in your elected officials' state or district are really in need of these very important supports that are available out there, why they shouldn't be cut back at a minimum, why they should be strengthened beyond that. Some folks are using them in planning for services and where to target those services. Others use it to track an individual client's progress, to do case management. So there are lots of uses for the Elder Index, and we love hearing about how our colleagues are using them, so let us know if you're using it in another way. That rounds out our presentation. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joe. That was really illuminating into a lot of the issues as someone who's working more in the domestic violence and sexual assault field, the challenges that survivors face. We often hear time and time again that it's these financial reasons why survivors in intimate partner relationships are unable to leave, and it's very clear when you're looking at some of those charts that it's having that second income is a huge benefit to making your ends meet, particularly when you're on those fixed incomes. Social Security doesn't come close to providing those benefits. And when we think about the states who are generally more supportive with a lot of their benefit programs, apparently those are the states where we are seeing the highest economic insecurity rates, which was really surprising to me when I learned of that. So more needs to be done to help address some of these income gaps, particularly for survivors who are considering this when they are looking at options to leave an abusive relationship or come up with the funds to support themselves, whether it's addressing some of the health needs or many challenges that they're facing. We also saw that people who are renters are going to be particularly vulnerable rather than individuals who have mortgages. Obviously, if there's a mortgage in the intimate partner relationship, there's other complications that arise from that. And, of course, as no surprise to anyone on the call, minority survivors are going to be particularly vulnerable. We saw that 81% of Hispanic elder women are economically insecure and 75% of African American women are economically insecure. So it probably makes a lot of sense to those of you who are direct service providers working with survivors and hearing a lot of these challenges. So it's something we're always trying to keep in mind in our work to educate other policymakers about these issues to help close those gaps, offer remedies, offer opportunities. So right now I'm going to turn it over to to Bonnie, who can talk a little bit more about elder abuse, because many of you on the call are very familiar with the economic issues older Americans face, but you may not be as knowledgeable about the possible intersections with domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And following Bonnie's presentation, I'll sum up a little bit about how this comes together and offer an opportunity for questions. So, Bonnie, I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and Joe. Sarah, I agree with everything that you just said about Joe's presentation. I found it very illuminating, and I'm very grateful to WOW for the work that you have done over the years focusing on economic insecurity, and particularly that you've designated time and energy to focusing on older adults. In many research projects or policy workshops around the country, the focus tends to be on younger people and younger victims, and so that you have carved out a specific project that takes a look specifically at the unique needs of older victims, and particularly and older women in particular, I think is really significant and important. And I am very grateful for this opportunity to be able to co-present with you and to have worked with you on projects in the past. I also want to thank the folks on the call. This is, as Sarah mentioned, World Elder Abuse Awareness Day was on Monday, so we're still in the week of that. And I know for some of you who are working in the elder abuse or abuse in later life fields, this has been a very busy week. So thank you for taking time out from your busy schedules to participate in this conversation. I've been asked to talk a little bit about elder abuse, abuse in later life, and sort of the intersection with this particular issue of economic insecurity, and then close by discussing a little bit the opportunities and what an exciting year it is to be doing this work given the White House Conference on Aging and some of the other things that have been occurring in the past year. So let's start with talking a little bit about aging. For folks who may not be familiar with the numbers, 10,000 Americans turn 65 every day. And it's my understanding that 10,000 Americans will turn 65 every day for the next 17 years. So if this is an issue that you're not working on yet, or you're not seeing many older victims or older adults in the work that you're doing, you will be seeing more older victims as time goes on. The composition of our country is changing, and it's going to affect all of the services and the way that all of us sort of interact within this society, and it needs to affect the way that we are providing services as domestic violence and sexual assault providers. Of course, as we notice the population aging, older women are going to be the largest percentage that we will be working with. I also want to highlight that for what sometimes in the aging field is called, defined the old, those who are 85 plus, that population is growing significantly as well. And that's particularly important when we talk about financial decision making and potential capacity issues, and I'll touch on that in a few moments. And then as the population is aging, racial and ethnic minority populations are increasing rapidly as well. And I think this is so important for us to recognize, given what Joe just told us about with her graphic of the economic security being significant populations or percentages of certain populations living within economic security, and that is only going to grow over the next few years. I had the privilege of being on the steering committee for the Elder Justice Roadmap Project. A report came out last summer, 2014, that helped with setting a strategy for the National Elder Justice Movement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes as well. But I have pulled the definition of elder abuse out from that report because that process was an opportunity for the elder abuse or elder justice field, the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services, and other federal organizations to come together and find common ground in terms of a definition for elder abuse. And so the definition that we're using for the work that we're doing now focuses on physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, as well as neglect, abandonment, and financial exploitation of an older adult. It acknowledges that the abuse can occur in any setting, which means we often see elder abuse happening in folks' private homes, but we acknowledge that it happens in public as well, and that sadly there is stalking in later life that occurs, and that, of course, abuse is happening in facilities such as nursing homes and assisted living and other types of facilities. And that in most of in these cases, what we see is that there's a relationship where there was an expectation of trust between the victim and the perpetrator, that these are relationships that are spouse-partner violence, adult children, other family members, caregivers, and others who are the abuser, or that in some cases the older person is targeted based on age or disability, and in many of the stranger scams we know that to be true. Unfortunately, elder abuse is a significant problem with large numbers of older adults being affected. A few years ago, a study was done where about 6,000 older adults were called and asked questions about the circumstances in their lives, and 1 in 10 of those older adults stated that they had been abused in some way in the past year. Important thing to keep in mind with this particular study is that all of the participants in the study had the financial resources to have a phone. They had the mobility to be able to get to the phone before the caller hung up. They had the capacity to be able to track and answer all of the questions, so there were no cognitive limitations or persons with significant dementia who participated, and no one who participated lived in a facility such as a nursing home. We know from other research that elder abuse disproportionately affects folks who are living in poverty, folks who are vulnerable in some way, and certainly people living in facilities. So we believe that this number, as startling as it is in fact a low number. And of course, sadly, like traditional domestic violence that affects folks who are about 18 to 40, many of the victims are women. Research is indicating about 2/3 of elder abuse victims are women. The cumulative toll of elder abuse hasn't been quantified in terms of large national prevalence or incidence studies or studies looking at the economic impact, but taking the smaller studies that have been done, the Elder Justice Roadmap, it suggests that more than 5 million people are affected by elder abuse and that the cost to society is in fact in the billions. And some of the costs that we see for victims themselves is directly related to health care. So victims of elder abuse are 4 times more likely to be admitted to a nursing home and 3 times more likely to be admitted to hospital settings. And the cost of financial exploitation is huge. This is a study that was done by MetLife only looking at newspaper accounts, so not a scientific study that went and talked to older adults themselves, but based on that study that was done a few years ago, the increase from 2008 to 2009 was about 12%, and again, we were in the billions of dollars lost here. And the challenge with financial exploitation, of course, for older adults is we know we've got the stranger scams, but we also know that a significant portion of financial exploitation is caregivers, adult children, other family members who are stealing or taking resources from the older adult, and that for folks later in life, it becomes much more difficult to recover those assets. They may not be working anymore. They may not be able to work anymore. And so for folks already living in economic insecurity, financial exploitation can be devastating. I mentioned earlier a slide about the high numbers of old that we are starting to see. And this is particularly important because what we know is that for folks who are 80 and older, right now about 1 in 2 of them will have some kind of dementia or beginning cognitive impairment such as Alzheimer's disease. And new research that's been coming out in the past couple of years has found that as our bodies age and our brain chemistry changes, even folks who don't have dementia or any kind of capacity issues begin as they get older, and so could be true for all of us, begin to change how they see financial interactions, and sometimes make more risky decisions than they did before in terms of giving money away or investing, or they may make decisions that are different than the kinds of decisions that they were making more conservatively in earlier years. And that we know that people who are starting to get dementia in those early stages, one of the first things that often goes for many folks is the ability to track financial information and understand the value of money. So people might be able to understand the math and the numbers, but they don't have the same understanding about how much money they might be giving as a gift or might be being exploited from them. And unfortunately, what this leads to is predators who understand these dynamics really targeting older adults and financially exploiting them. So this ties us so directly to the report and why I am so grateful for the work that WOW has done on this topic, because with the challenges that survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in later life face, economic insecurity becomes one of the significant challenges that limits the options that are often available to older adults. As Sarah has said so well earlier in this webinar, is folks who have limited options will see either perceive or in actuality have significantly limited choices about what they're going to be able to do, and may find themselves trapped in situations that they want to be able to change or get out of, but find it difficult or impossible based on the economic reality that they find themselves in. So if someone is being abused by a caregiver but has limited financial options, they may feel like this is the only caregiver they can afford. They don't have the option to go out and choose another caregiver. They may not be able to leave an abusive husband of 60 years because they live in a community where there isn't affordable housing, and he's controlled all of the money over the years, and they don't have access to those kinds of resources. So these economic issues, I think, are front and center for so many survivors. Over the years, I've had the privilege of sitting in on support groups for older battered women, and when I've asked them to talk to me about the challenges that they face and what are the issues that they'd like to see me work on addressing on a policy level and to include in training, always in the top 3 economic issues come up for older survivors. And it's why this information from WOW becomes so important for us to be able to take to our policy leaders and back to our programs to help us try to figure out how do we address economic insecurity and what can we do to improve the status that's currently out there, because it really will make a significant difference in the lives of victims and survivors if we're able to do that. So let me take a few minutes to talk about the opportunities that are out there before we open it up for additional questions. I mentioned earlier when I pulled up the definition, the Elder Justice Roadmap. If you've not seen this document, you can see the link on your screen now. As I mentioned, this came out in 2014, and it was a wonderful process funded by the Department of Justice and Health and Human Services, where we asked 750 people in the field to give us ideas about how to identify, prevent, and address elder abuse. We took all of that data that we got, we sorted it into different clusters, we put headers on the top of those clusters, we ranked the ideas that came in, we sorted the ideas that came in. I, as I said, was part of the steering group that had the privilege of also conducting some small group interviews on topics that we wanted to do a deeper dive into so we would have a better understanding. And national leaders and stakeholders came together several times to look at all of the data. And the end result is the product you see on your screen. The purpose of putting this document together was to give us some strategies and priorities as where we can move forward as a field. And so I think it's a really exciting tool for giving us some data about elder abuse, a definition, and ideas of what you can do in your community to move forward. Just to highlight how important economics were in the discussion, we had 5 top priorities that came out of the process, economics being one of them, and sort of the two flip sides of economics. One is trying to really quantify and understand the cost of elder abuse so that we can talk to policymakers about why we need to step up and do more on this particular issue, and then also really addressing the huge fiscal cost to families and societies. I'd also mention, before I get into talking about the Abuse in Later Life program, building on what Joe and Sarah said, this is the year of the White House Conference on Aging. That conference happens every 10 years, and this year the process has been to hold a series of meetings throughout the country. Some of them you might have seen happened in states and regions across the country. And leading up to the White House Conference on Aging, which will happen in July, there have also been a series of meetings in D.C. I've had the privilege of attending 3 events hosted by the White House in the last few months, one sponsored by the Council for Women and Girls, one sponsored by the White House Domestic Violence Advisor, and on Tuesday, one sponsored by the Department of Justice and the White House, bringing together national leaders within elder justice as well as from the financial industry and the private foundations to really talk about how we can move this issue forward. So I'm hopeful that there have been many exciting conversations on the national level that will lead to more partnerships and resources as we do our work together. And then finally, for those of you on the call who are thinking, I would love to do more, but we need resources to do that, I just want to mention that the Office on Violence Against Women does fund a program called the Abuse in Later Life program. If you look on their website, the title is much longer. This is the shorter title here. It's a very small program. Only about 9 communities a year get funding. $400,000 go out to each community that are used over a 3-year period, and the money must be used to provide training to law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, victim services, and others, both direct training and some cross-training. Every community is required to create or enhance a coordinated community response team, and then finally a quarter of the money must be used to develop or enhance victim services for older victims. To apply, you need MOU partners from law enforcement, prosecution, adult protective services or aging, and a domestic violence or sexual assault program. And if you have more questions about this program, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, the program I'm the director of, provides technical assistance, and we are more than happy to answer questions. This map shows you how, even though we are a small program, we consider ourselves small but mighty as we move across the country trying to get information about elder abuse throughout the United States. And as you look at this map, if you see that you're in a state where there has not been a project, we really strongly would encourage you to apply. And even if you're in a state but in a different part of the state, this is really a fabulous program that focuses on collaboration. So on that note, Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to you for final comments and questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie. The information you shared was very, very helpful and provides a lot of great intersectionality regarding the many challenges older survivors of abuse face. And the numbers are alarming, as you mentioned, and as we know, they're just going to continue to grow. So it's important to keep an eye out for what we can do around these issues. As you can see just briefly from my slide here, WOW produced a brief a couple years ago, I believe it was 2013, on older survivors and economic security. And this highlights a lot of WOW's own findings, and we did this in partnership with the National Center on Abuse in Later Life to talk about some of these issues. So that could be a great resource for all of you who want to, do some additional learning following the webinar. A lot of the highlights included finding that insecurity is complicated by a lifetime of lower incomes, having limited or no retirement savings, and the very high housing and health costs individuals face. We also see that there's, as we mentioned throughout this conversation, limited opportunities to achieve safety and justice because of some of financial abuse, dependency for basic needs, isolation, and disability. I should also mention, as we talk about safety here, the criminal justice system has a pretty clear role that they can play in addressing some of these issues. We haven't always engaged them as a partner around economic issues. However, in our brief, we do talk about some clear ways and offer some strategies of how they could alleviate some of the financial barriers that survivors face and help them recover, importantly, recover some of those costs. Often we see the burden falling on direct service providers. Many of you are on the call today, and you're expected to wave these magic wands to fix a lot of these economic issues, but it's something that requires a lot of thoughtful policy, not just at a legislative level, but also internal institutional policies at the direct service community and justice level. So if you can turn to those briefs, and I have the link in the next slide where you can see that resource. It could be a good document as another learning opportunity and a source to start to build some of these efforts. We have a few resources that I wanted to share here, including the Economic Security Index, which holds our elder economic security information, and our Family Economic Security Index. We have, as Joe had mentioned, our Living Below the Line Elder Economics Insecurity Rate Briefs will be coming out in just a couple of weeks in July, and you'll be able to find that information on our Economic Security Institute. And as you can see at the bottom, there's a link for the brief, and I also included the great resources that Bonnie's organization has. So if there are any questions, I encourage you to send them to the WOW administrator or directly to each of the speakers. One of the questions I'm seeing is for you, Joe. Can you talk a little bit more just what those driving factors are, those high costs that are really harming or undermining the ability of seniors to be economically secure?
Sure. Actually, I think you mentioned them yourself, and I think that housing and healthcare costs, out-of-pocket healthcare costs, really lead the parade. Actually, I was reviewing your brief that you did, part of your population policy series on older survivors earlier today, and I noticed that you mentioned that although older adults spend about the same amount of their income, proportionately as younger folks, on housing, food, and transportation, when it comes to health care, they're spending about twice as much of their income on that as younger people. And that stands to reason when you think about it. You know, we have the onset of chronic conditions and other issues as we age. I'm experiencing that myself. And also, women tend to live longer. They tend to outlive their husbands. They have less income frequently at that point, with the same typical expenses for housing. And because they have these higher rates of functional impairments and chronic conditions, they're having to spend more on living independently or trying to continue to live independently. So those are some of the drivers. And also, you know, when you look at the costs on our elder index for housing, you know, older renters are right in the middle of older owners who are still paying on their mortgage, and people who actually no longer have to pay a mortgage. But the highest costs then are the ones who are still paying a mortgage on their homes. But those are also folks who tend to have a higher income. So relatively speaking, it ends up being the renters who are in the most difficult position, and that's why we focus on them.
And when I hear that, I just think of the top three barriers that we often hear from survivors in general, and probably most of this is going to be skewed because child care is among the top three, but housing, transportation, child care are often cited as the top three barriers, and it's, you know, very clear as these housing costs are very high. The supports that are available don't help fill that gap, and especially when there's limited affordable housing options, particularly if there's a safety issue, it can become very challenging, and that doesn't even speak to the high cost of institutionalization and doing that. We know those costs are just kind of astronomical to receive that kind of care and home. I'm just trying to see, are there any other questions coming up? I'll give you all a moment to use the meeting chat.
Can I just add something? Yeah. I would just add that on that housing cost, we also see this shrinking of the federal commitment to providing low-income housing, which just exacerbates this gap. And, you know, no longer building Section 202 or very little, and always a long waiting list for assisted housing. So it's not, that's why we don't consider that to be a measure of people's economic security, whether they have that or not, because there's lots of folks who are eligible who can't get it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jo. And I guess a question for you, Bonnie, is what kind of resources are available specifically for elder survivors of abuse?
Sarah, on the local level, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So certainly domestic violence and sexual violence programs know a lot about how to work with survivors, and I think we need to honor what we do well. Our empowerment model works very well of providing options to older survivors and hearing their story, listening, providing support, 24-hour crisis line, safety planning, legal advocacy. So for programs who are working primarily with younger women really trust what you already do well, and then think about how you want to tailor that to work with older survivors. So on economic issues, if you're really great at helping with job training or job placement or getting TANF or welfare type funding, think about what you need to learn or who you would partner with to help learn about pensions and Social Security and the issues that are going to be more relevant later in life. In terms of other partners, the Aging Services Network can be great. If you're not familiar with what your area agency on aging does, they often provide transportation programs to break isolation, a variety of things that can be hugely helpful for older adults. If you're in a situation where you have some concerns about somebody and want someone other than law enforcement to go out and do an investigation, Adult Protective Services is the social service arm that goes out and does investigations. Unlike Child Protective Services, they can't remove anybody from a home, but they can go out and see what's going on in those particular cases and provide some information, some referrals, and some connections with other people. So those would be sort of the top three places I would start looking.
Great, thanks. And I guess another question I could go to both of you and try to combat this really difficult housing challenge. Are there any great models out there that you can share or strategies that have been used in any of the communities or programs you've been working with?
I don't know if Bonnie has a comment on that. I recently was out in Anne Arundel, Maryland, making a presentation, and a woman raised this prospect of shared housing. Having folks find someone who has a home that they don't want to sell and has extra room because there's no longer a family there, and maybe they can share housing with someone else who needs to move out of their situation or needs to find a situation to move into, period. And that appears to be not widespread yet, but there are projects like that here and there around the country, and there are folks who are trying to make that more widespread opportunity. There are just also with the generation, the cohort that is the baby boomers that is reaching retirement age now, a lot of people who are trying experiments on buying into or renting into settings where several different households are close by each other and working together, sharing meals and so on. I'm not talking about naturally occurring retirement communities where they just happen to be in an area that has aged into that kind of a situation, but where they're choosing to pick people that they would be sort of in an affinity group with because of old friendships or because of a religious tie or something else to create a setting where they could share housing. Bonnie, any thoughts?
Well, I think you've addressed housing. I think those are great ideas as well. I think for folks who need emergency housing, this really is a challenge in many communities, and it's really important to meet with your other partners. Some older victims do great staying at a domestic violence shelter. For others, that's really a challenging and may not be possible. They may have physical limitations or some health issues. They may be uncomfortable in a chaotic environment with a lot of kids. And so trying to figure out other places where people can stay and you can bring the services to them is great. And then for folks on the call who might be doing transitional housing, I think transitional housing is such a great option for older adults who maybe need a slow transition to figure out the next step in their life. And I think there are a handful of really good transitional housing programs across the country focused specifically on older adults, but not nearly enough emphasis yet in that area.
Great, thanks. I believe we've actually come to the end of our time, and I want to respect everyone's other work that they need to do today, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. Joe and Bonnie, thank you so much for the amazing information that you shared. It's a lot to think about. There are significant challenges out there, but we know there's a lot of great creative minds who are working to hopefully remedy them and alleviate some of these challenges. So older survivors have more options available to them, and it's going to take, as I had mentioned and it has been alluded to throughout this conversation, a community-wide effort, not just the advocates, not just the criminal justice system and just other community institutions. We all need to come together to start strategically thinking about how we can address some of these significant economic costs and the challenges that older survivors are facing. So I hope that you will all join us in doing so and trying to move these issues forward and join the coalitions who are working around these issues. And again, I thank Joe and Bonnie for their expertise and leadership in these areas and for their time in joining us, especially knowing it's such a busy week. But we really appreciate that time. I should also mention we'll be sending out this recording later this week or early next week, along with the PowerPoint presentations and other resources that might be beneficial to you all. Again, thank you so much for joining us. That concludes today's webinar. I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thank you.